Hello, everybody. Welcome to another of our short teach-in videos. My name is George Dunn, and I am the Chief Executive of the Tenant Farmers Association. This teach-in is part of a series of teach-ins in which we attempt to shine a spotlight on topical issues faced by the tenanted sector of agriculture. And it is part of our growing YouTube library, which also features webinars and news updates from previous weeks. So don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss out on any new content as it is being published. Today, I'm delighted that we've got Caroline Squire. She's one of our expert rural surveyors here at the TFA, and she's going to be talking through some of the key points to consider when assessing a rent review proposal and whether your landlord's rent proposal is actually justified. But before we start, I'd like to say that we are delighted that Roythorn's solicitors are sponsoring the TFA 2024 virtual teach-in sessions. For those of you who don't know Roythorn's is a national law firm steeped in agriculture. They have some 90 years experience in advising tenant farmers and landowners alike, and their lawyers are active in farm tenancy policy groups, so they also see the bigger picture. So whether it's a succession application, or it's a new farm business tenancy, or a dispute with your landlord, a share farming agreement, a collaborative natural capital agreement, Roythorn's is there to be able to act and assist you in those situations. So moving back to what we're doing today, today's teach-in is on how to assess a rent review proposal, and is your landlord's rent proposal justified? For information, we are recording this during the spring of 2024, so everything we cover today is correct at the time of recording. So for any specific advice on your individual circumstances, we recommend that you call the TFA head office and ask to speak to one of our team of advisors like Caroline. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Caroline Squire, who, as I say, is one of our specialist rural surveyor advisors. Welcome, Caroline. Over to you.
Thank you, George. So here at TFA, we've seen a huge amount of rent review activity this spring, and there are still plenty of landlords seeking rent increases. With subsidies decreasing and input costs increasing and the weather impacting levels of production, I would say it's more important now than ever to ensure that any upwards movement in rent is fully justified, rather than simply just accepting an increase for sake of keeping the peace. If we could go to the next slide, please. So if we first have a look at how the rent is assessed under the different acts, I'll start with the Agricultural Holdings Act. So the rent properly payable under the AHA, it's determined by the rent formula, which consists of, firstly, the terms of the tenancy. That will include things like who is responsible for repairs and insurance and what the associated costs of those things are. The character and situation of the holding. So, for example, what the physical limitations of the holding are. That would be the soil type, proximity to markets, etc. Thirdly, the productive and earning capacity of the holding. So that's what the farm can typically yield in terms of crops, milk, or livestock, based on the farm's physical characteristics. And then off the back of that, what the farm can realistically expect to earn from that level of production. And this is based on a suitable farming system, which a competent hypothetical tenant would employ on the holding. So it's not necessarily what the tenant is doing on the ground, although often that is a good place to start. And finally, the current level of rent for comparable lettings is the final part of the rent formula, and that is what other tenants are paying by way of rent for similar farms let on similar terms. So in terms of justifying a rent increase proposal under the Agricultural Holdings Act, the landlord is going to have to provide budgetary evidence and comparable evidence, which encompasses all of the elements within the AHA rent review formula. So, for example, a budget that won't only take into account the costs and income associated with what the farm can produce, based on the farm's physical characteristics, but also the costs associated with the terms of the tenancy, so repair and insurance costs, for example. And the landlord is also going to have to provide comparable evidence to show what other tenants are paying but for other AHA tenancies, because FBTs, they aren't relevant comparables because they're not let on similar terms. It's only AHA tenancies which are relevant as comparable evidence. And they also need to provide details of those comparables in order that you can assess whether they are genuinely comparable, and if there are any differences, the values need to be adjusted as necessary. And budgetary and comparable evidence carry equal weight in the AHA rent review formula. So they're both equally important. And from a tenant's point of view, especially, budgets are particularly important because they often suggest that the rent ought to be lower than what the comparable valuation method would suggest. So it's always important to ensure that budgets are considered and not just comparables. So moving on to the Agricultural Tenancies Act, which governs farm business tenancies. For FBTs, firstly, it's important to refer to the tenancy agreement just to check the basis for how the rent is to be set. Due to freedom of contract, it's possible to agree various ways of setting the rent. For example, it could be linked to the RPI or even the price of wheat. But if the FBT is silent, then the statutory provisions for rent will apply. And likewise, the statutory basis itself could be written directly into the tenancy agreement. So this advice is based on if the statutory basis applies for rent reviews. So the statutory basis is the rent at which the holding might reasonably be expected to be let on the open market by a willing landlord to a willing tenant, taking into account all relevant factors, including the terms of the tenancy. Therefore, under this Act, comparable evidence of what similar farms have let for locally is paramount in determining the rent properly payable. And in respect of a rent proposal, the landlord needs to provide details of the comparables so that you can judge whether they are genuinely comparable. So they can do this on an anonymous basis, but they ought to provide information such as the quality and grade of land, what buildings are the landlord's, repairing obligations within the lease, the size of the farmhouse, whether the land is fenced, watered, etc. And where there are any differences, then adjustments to the value ought to be made as necessary. So, for example, if grade 2 arable land is valued at £150 an acre in the comparable, but the subject farm's arable land is only grade 3, you might reduce this value to, say, £130 an acre as appropriate. Next slide, please. So for both AHA and FBT tenancies, often landlords will make rent proposals to their tenants and just provide the figures that they want without any justification whatsoever. In this case, it's important to request their evidence which justifies their proposal, because without this, their argument would have absolutely no legs at arbitration anyway. And oftentimes we see that after being asked for this evidence, the landlord drops the idea of pursuing a rent increase because they're actually unable to justify it and unable to provide this evidence. But if the landlord does provide the evidence, it's then a case of assessing the evidence, picking holes in it as necessary in order to be able to negotiate. For example, perhaps they've used an unrealistically high price of wheat in their budget, or perhaps they're comparing the subject farm to a comparable with much better quality land. And they may not have taken that into account when doing the comparable valuation of the farm. Do also remember that under both acts, all tenants' improvements and fixtures are disregarded because the tenant is only paying rent on what the landlord has provided. So this may affect the suitable farming system under the Agricultural Holdings Act when considering a budget. So for example, if the farm is only dairy due to the tenant's investment, if they've installed a parlour and a cubicle building themselves, and then those are disregarded, it actually may be a less profitable sheep and beef system is suitable for the farm, and therefore that's what the budget ought to be based on. And finally, do also remember that if the tenant is pursuing the decrease in rent, the same applies. So the tenant will have to provide evidence to justify why a decrease is valid in order to be able to pursue the matter. So they would also need to provide comparables and or budgetary evidence in order to justify why a rent decrease is in order.
Caroline, that was absolutely fantastic. Thanks very much for going through that in such detail. So we're talking today about how we assess rent reviews and whether the proposals from landlords can be justified. Just a few questions, Caroline, just on what you've had to say. Something we quite often get within the TFA where a landlord springs a rent review proposal a week before the review date and is threatening arbitration if the tenant doesn't agree. What should the tenant do in those circumstances?
Yeah, so often landlords can try this trick, as you say, George, to try and bully tenants into agreeing new rents. It's important not to feel pressured to agree to a new rent just for the sake of agreeing it before the review date. If no new rent is agreed before the rent review date, it doesn't necessarily mean the matter will go to arbitration. Either the rent review notice will become null and void if no action is taken prior to the review date, or if the landlord wants to pursue a change in the rent, they'll have to apply for the appointment of an arbitrator before the review date. But in practice, the arbitrator can be put on hold, and all this really does is provide more time for negotiations. Furthermore, if the matter did end up going to arbitration, this kind of behaviour isn't going to look very favourably on the landlord in respect of an award of costs at the end of the arbitration. And also the new landlord and tenant code of practice, it does state that whoever initiates the rent review is supposed to set out a timetable for how the review is to take shape. So going forward, following the publication of the code of practice, this should prevent landlords from serving rent review notices and then doing very little right up until before the review date. Or at least if they do try that, then they can be called out for that bad behaviour because it's poor practice.
Yeah, that code of practice should certainly help in terms of making sure that landlords don't come so late in the day the first time a proposal is tabled. Okay, so I'm a tenant farmer. My rent hasn't been reviewed for 6 years. So due to the time that's elapsed, does that mean an increase is now due?
So often landlords will try to argue that an increase is due because the rent hasn't been reviewed for X number of years. But the length of time since the last review is irrelevant in terms of assessing the rent properly payable. What is relevant is the budgetary and or comparable evidence as at the review date. So it's important to ask for this and disregard any argument around the length of time since the last review.
Okay, and just finally then, should I provide my own budget and comparables to counter anything the landlord might put forward?
If the landlord is the one seeking to change the rent, then the onus should be on them to provide the evidence to justify that. I wouldn't suggest spending the time and effort pulling together your own evidence until the landlord has provided you with their evidence and until you've gone back to the landlord to flag up the flaws within that evidence. And if at that point negotiations are still proving fruitless and it looks as though the matter may go to arbitration, then I would suggest putting your own evidence forward to support your own proposal to counter the landlord's proposal.
Thanks, Caroline. Our time is gone for more questions, but anybody that does have any more questions on individual circumstances, why don't you consider becoming a member of the TFA if you're not a member already? Currently, membership is excellent value for money at just £249 per year, and that gives you access to dedicated advice, information, and support from experts just like Caroline. So for more information about the TFA and how we can support you and all farmers in England and Wales who don't own the land that they farm, why don't you visit the website www.tfa.org.uk, and you'll find information there about our upcoming calendar of events as well as latest news affecting your sector. So really hope that you have found this teaching useful. Let us know in the comments below what you thought of this short video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any new content as we produce it. There are other teachings that you can go and have a look at. There's one on the difference between tenants fixtures and tenants improvements and their treatment in FBT and AHA tenancies. There's another one about what can I do if my landlord won't give me consent to expand my slurry store. And also another about what to watch out for when signing up to a new FBT agreement. All very useful advice there. So many thanks again to Roy Thorne Solicitors for sponsoring our virtual program of TFA teach-ins this year. Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you for watching.